obviously, historically, the idea that like you have to disclaim that you're not being anti-Semitic, or you use all this language that makes it feel like you've done something wrong even when you haven't, is part and parcel of how you keep people from talking about this issue and scare people out of talking about this issue at all. And seeing Mark Ruffalo do that little backpedal is part and parcel of that. At the same time, there is a small part of me that gets a little nervous that that there are people waiting to exploit, anti-Semites that are waiting to exploit a kind of flattened narrative. You know what I mean? I don't want to be so strident that I have no room in me to think that there's any good faith pushback at all when it comes to the language being used, even if I am much more hostile to pushback about the substance of how the events are being described. Do you know what I mean? Am I being overly sensitive?
I wouldn't say you're being overly sensitive, because obviously anti-Semitism is a real thing. Hate crimes are real things, but they're largely divorced from what's happening in the Middle East with actual American policy with regards to Israel and Palestine. It's more, anti-Semites will use any sort of topic in order to further their agenda or to prosper. That doesn't mean we have a blanket injunction about talking about things in real, truthful terms about, apartheid in Israel, or things like, we just saw anti-Semitism used as a cudgel against the left wing of the Labour Party in the UK.
Yeah.
For the second half of the last decade. And is that an excuse to not talk about income inequality?
Well, right. I mean, so there are clearly bad faith actors, but for example, so Mark Ruffalo's tweet. So he tweeted, "I have reflected and wanted to apologize for posts during the recent Israel-Hamas fighting that suggested Israel is committing, quote, genocide. It is not accurate. It's inflammatory, disrespectful, and is being used to justify anti-Semitism here and abroad. Now is the time to avoid hyperbole." I mean, what on earth kind of pressure is being put on Mark Ruffalo that he feels like he has to backtrack from using a word that the international community, if I understand it right, everyone but America has come to land on that word. All of the people who are experts in such things, all of the international bodies have been using that word with respect to what's happening to Palestinians for years. And it is, I don't know, the fact that someone like Mark Ruffalo, who has been such an advocate for so long, would feel the need to say something like this, it makes me want to be not accepting of this, but sensitive to the kind of pressures that people are under and try to figure out a way to help guard against, I think, the blowback that is 100% coming. I don't think, over the past few days, I've come to believe that the shift, the Overton window shift that we've all been observing is flimsier. I don't think it's a real shift. I mean, I think there's been a discursive shift, but like we talk about, Twitter's a small part of the population, and by and large, this isn't something like, it's not something like Black Lives Matter, where there is a kind of, among the liberal professional media types, there is a kind of herd mentality. Like, okay, that's the thing. We're on board with that as a slogan. Is that even true? Because I feel
largely they were like the liberal types. Yeah. Even if they're like, oh, but no abolish, no defund, no actual changes or anything. We just like the slogan and the hashtag,
Well, I thought that was true too, until I just saw this chart showing that, and this isn't media. I know that you're saying media, but that white support for Black Lives Matter surged last spring, but then fell to lower than it had been pre-Floyd.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I see in the media also, and frankly have throughout, yes, there's like a broad support for the idea that kneeling on someone's neck until they die on camera is not good. But even people like Don Lemon, there's a certain degree to which they've all been manufacturing consent for the idea that we should do the barest minimum here, that you have to fund the police, that there's a diversity of opinion among the Black community about the desire for police in neighborhoods. Joe Biden never flinched on saying we're going to fund the police more. Today's the 1-year anniversary, as we're recording, of the George Floyd's murder, and Biden's blowing by the deadline he set for himself to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And it's like, well, how much consensus is there, and what is the consensus for exactly? And the same can be said of Palestine. I mean, maybe there's a consensus for don't literally kill Palestinian babies and live stream it, but maybe it's just very limited.
Well, I think, when it comes to the reason why support for Black Lives Matter dropped so precipitously since the protests, I think it's two reasons. Like, one, you have just like the straight right-wing reaction to it, which, as those protests, fell off the front page, I think the kind of like right-wing whisper networks and, propaganda, I think, absorbed a larger proportion of the rhetorical space about Black Lives Matter, took up a bigger chunk of the discussion. And I think another part of it is BLM served its purpose for people like Joe Biden, for, the Democratic Party establishment. And like after the election, it's like, okay, thanks for your input. And, he's a guy who like even, who held it at arm's length and used it as a way to signal to quote unquote moderates that, hey, I don't support like some of the more radical stuff going on in the BLM movement. I support the slogan, which is like a nice, easy thing to do. But,
it's like the lowest bar in the world.
Yeah,
Black Lives Matter could not be a lower bar.
Yeah, all these folks saying, defund and abolish, like, hey, that's not me. I'm a law and order kind of guy. And, to some degree, that just means that, the people who had a lot of faith in activists who had a lot of faith in, getting rid of Trump and, electing Biden, they just got chewed up and spit out. And I think, we saw effectively the same thing around Me Too.
For sure. So what do you think then? Because I think both of us were speaking much more optimistically than this about Palestine last week. And I'm not saying, everything's not linear. History comes in ebbs and flows, and this might be a 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards situation that's ultimately progress. Yeah. I don't know, man. I just thinking about the George Floyd today has got my heckles raised a little. I'm writing a piece that may or may not be out by the time we publish this episode, where I have revisited the famous clip from the leaked Biden call last fall that was tragically undercovered.
The president has power. He has the bully pulpit. He has moral authority. And so we would ask you to lend your voice and your strength and your influence and your power and your ability to reach across the aisle to try and pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. But failing that, we would ask you to pull from that act measures that can be enacted by executive order. You have the power to call for a national database on police misconduct. You have the power to ask for a registry that will allow people to easily search in public multiple misconduct complaints against particular officers. You have the ability to impose a database around police killings and police shootings. We know everything that happens to police officers because the FBI keeps a database. But we rely on the Washington Post to tell us how many people have been shot and killed by the police and what the racial breakdown is of those statistics. We need good data so that we can understand what is really happening around policing. And these are things that you can do by executive order. Most important and most overarching, Mr. President-elect, is the power that you have, and in fact, the obligation that you have under one of the most important civil rights statutes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prevents the federal government from providing funding to any program that engages in discrimination. It was used originally, and in fact enacted, to compel school districts to comply with desegregation orders, recalcitrant school districts. But Title VI applies across the board to every program. It makes sense, right? The federal government should not be funding programs engaged in discrimination, but it has never been enforced against law enforcement. And I would ask that you would articulate clearly the indication, the intention of this administration to apply Title VI to every program. If you are a state or local program and you engage in discrimination, you cannot receive federal funds. What that means is that there needs to be created a kind of protocol for Title VI. And you could do this very easily for law enforcement. What do your diversity numbers look like? What do your stop and arrest numbers look like by race? What do your shooting numbers look like by race? Do you have implicit bias training? What have you done to remove white supremacists from your police departments? These are actions that you can take that indeed I would suggest you are compelled to take by Title VI, which requires the federal government to ensure that their programs, their money does not support programs that engage in discrimination.
So this is the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, one of the most high-ranking and knowledgeable civil rights lawyers in America, saying that Joe Biden has the authority to use executive orders to achieve much, not all, but much of what is in the George Floyd Act. And today, we see a host of people manufacturing consent for the idea that because he can't get the votes in Congress, he can't do anything at all, including civil rights leaders like Al Sharpton, who was on that call, who last night tweeted, "I told him that although I appreciate his announced deadline on the Floyd Justice and Policing Act, I'd rather have legislation with teeth than a hard deadline. Good conversation." As though it's an either or, as though the only thing Joe Biden could do is pass something that was toothless or do nothing at all. It makes me furious that not only has no one picked up on the fact that Sherlyn Ifill asked him to do this by executive order, do these things by executive order, specifically create a police registry, use Title VI, which was, established to deny federal funding for schools that were segregated, to go ahead and do the same thing for police precincts that were doing a racism. That's well within his authority. And his response to her in the context of that call was a very angry, it's not constitutional, I'm not going to do it. And I've now spent, the day talking to a couple of law professors, constitutional authorities, who say that that's absolutely ridiculous. And not only is no journalist picking up on this, Sherlyn Ifill herself doesn't seem interested in engaging and blocked me weeks ago because I kept tagging her in this clip. Not hostily. I never blamed her for anything. Until she blocked me, I didn't see her. I thought I was helping her cause by elevating her demand and hoping to get some journalists to pay attention to it. I have the utmost respect for Sherlyn Ifill and her work, and I think she's completely right in this regard. It's astonishing to me how quickly the tides can turn, how much someone like Joe Biden can get away with this, even in the context of a huge protest movement. And that makes me somewhat pessimistic and skeptical of what's going to happen with this conversation around Palestine.
You should be pessimistic because nothing changed. Nothing really changed. There hasn't been a substantial change in public opinion. Maybe you can read some tea leaves and think, oh, okay, there's a kind of a baby step towards a new direction. But honestly, the polling that I looked at, it's the attitudes, just of American adults, attitudes towards Israel, Palestine have been very consistent over the past 20 years. And I think there's a reason for that. It's because after the withdrawal from Gaza, after the second Intifada, actual Israeli policy has been very consistent since then. And maybe they've gotten a little sharper at managing the propaganda side of it. But these riots and the raising of settlements, the incursions into Gaza, this all pretty much plays out in the same script every time. And I remember every time this comes, every time this takes over the news, which is about once every 2 to 3 years at this point, the operating procedure is pretty much the same. They go in and the IDF, they go into Gaza and they mow the grass. And I'm not really sure what's going to change that equilibrium, but what we've just seen from, the political establishment side of it anyway, there's been no change whatsoever. It's the exact same policy. It doesn't really matter who the president is. The only thing we can trust Biden on is to not, do something like move the embassy to Jerusalem. But critically, he's not gonna roll anything back when there's a far right, administration. Or put that another way, but we know that Democrats like Biden are not going to roll back the hostile actions of, right-wing administrations. We saw that with Obama and Bush, and we're seeing it now with Biden and Trump. So, at the end of the day, it feels bad. And I'm not really sure what would, catalyze a, massive change in not just attitudes towards Israel, but just, just American policy towards Israel. I don't really think there is anything right now capable of doing that.
Well, yeah, that's the thing that, I mean, to your point about policy not changing, we were having a conversation about whether the narrative possibilities are changing and whether public opinion is changing. But I think you're, connecting those two. Yeah, I think it doesn't matter if nothing substantively changes. And that's the thing with George Floyd and every other thing under the sun. I feel like sometimes I tweet and I complain a lot. And there are folks who say, Briahna, all you ever do is be big mad online. Can't Biden live? Like, why won't you give him credit for anything? And it's because I feel this enormous pressure to draw attention to the gap between the pablum, the language that's used, all of the weird, goofy speak about you're going to get a seat at the table and I see you, I hear you, and the fact that literally nothing has fundamentally changed as promised. And that requires a kind of hypervigilance given the complicity of the liberal media establishment in laundering Biden's inaction as a good thing. Like I was reading an Ebony article, classic historical Black magazine.
I know what Ebony is.
Well, I'm explaining for the audience, not experts in Black culture like you, Virgil. And it's an interview with Cedric Richmond, who we all remember is Biden's right-hand man, who was there on that leaked call, and Biden referred to him on that call as like his number one, who was in the room for every decision, who was also was a congresswoman from the most polluted, from the district in Louisiana that had 7 out of the 10 most polluted air tracts in America, Mr. like oil and gas lobby. And Ebony chooses on the anniversary of George Floyd's death to print a softball interview with him where he basically, the first question is like, tell me why it's important for Biden to be sitting with George Floyd's family today at the White House. So basically, let's announce to all of our readers that Biden really likes Black people because he invited some over for dinner. The next question in this investigative interview is, as you said, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death, and the White House has done a lot in making sure that he is remembered. One of the measures that President Biden has championed and Congress has been pushing for in the wake of his murder is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Though the president wanted to have this bill passed by now, it is unfortunately still held up in the Senate. What is the current status of the bill? Like, there's no question about why it's held up, what Biden has been doing to usher it through. And meaningfully, Sherlyn Ifill in that clip before the part that I played was like, we all both know that Congress isn't just about tallying votes. It's about using the pulpit of the presidency to advocate for things and shift public opinion and put pressure on people who aren't already on board with you. And there seems to be no awareness of that kind of mechanism in this coverage or any coverage. I don't mean to call out Ebony in particular. It's no worse than anybody else, but it just hurts me more because it's in a magazine that's trusted by members of my own community to a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to that, I think, Biden has pretty much, I think he's pretty much said who he is. I think he's like, very staunchly on the right when it comes to Israel, for instance, which is why that's nothing that we saw from Biden or the State Department is, during the recent conflict. None of that's very surprising at all, I don't think. I think what's interesting is the kind of hypocrisy that it exposed from certain establishmentarians who have professed a commitment to human rights and justice, particularly in the context of last year's protests. And this time around, when you ask them about Palestinians, they're like, well, Hamas has got to cut it out and Israel has a right to defend itself. And that's it. It's craven. And so, when it comes to, police reform at the national scale, I mean, I did not have any faith in, Biden to do anything differently other than maybe, some kind of like staffing changes at the Justice Department. But by and large, things are just going to keep on rolling.
That feels like I don't want to say there's a way that leftists will say, well, how could you expect things to be any better? Everyone's always trash. I know that's not exactly what you're saying, but there's a way that can end up, I feel like, deflating the energy out of a moment where people should be big mad. People should be angry. Yeah. And it channels it into a kind of complacency. Like, oh, well, everyone's terrible. What did you expect? Like, no. Sherrilyn Ifill, one of the professors that I reached out to pointed out that even what Sherrilyn Ifill was demanding is milquetoast nothingness. Oh, you want a registry of how many people the police murder every year? Yeah. A federal registry, so you don't have to rely on some Washington Post reporter that's just keeping a random tally on their little flip spiral notepad.
We demand spreadsheets. Yes.
It's arguably your obligation as the president to use your federal power under Title VI to actually make sure that all federal programs don't all programs receiving federal money don't discriminate against people, not just schools. There's this question about getting a seat at the table versus getting a voice.
Yeah.
But they were very clear. We need someone in the Attorney General's office who knows what's going on, who can hit the ground day one and undo everything that Trump has done. Someone who has the trust of the civil rights community. And we got Merrick Garland.
Yeah, we got
they were concerned about what it meant to pick Tom Vilsack as Secretary of Agriculture because he's so deeply unpopular in Georgia and they hadn't won Georgia yet. And when, I forget who it was on the call, brought that up, Joe Biden was so dismissive and so rude. And everyone just keeps taking it. Everyone keeps taking it. There's no pushback. There's no journalistic pushback. We remember April Ryan when this story broke, when this tape was leaked, was like, how dare someone leak this? We should only have leaks that are authorized by the president. Also, insiders are telling me that Biden wasn't rude or taciturn. It was more that he was just impassioned. Insiders. Oh, so the people on the call who are running cover for Joe Biden's behavior on the call, halfway through that clip I played you, I don't know if you noticed, Joe Biden turns off his camera and literally dips. I was on a Clubhouse call a couple nights ago. I was up real late. And I said, I had racing thoughts. And I said, well, let me just listen to Clubhouse for 2 seconds and then go to bed. And I ended up getting pulled onto the stage within seconds of joining the room. And they asked me to talk because the subject was, is the Democratic Party racist too? Or something like that. Is the Democratic Party good for Black people? And Roland Martin was in the talk. And people were extremely mad at him because they were asking, is the Black media running cover for Biden? Why aren't you guys asking him questions? How did we end up in this situation where the most right-wing guy in the race ended up being president? And now why aren't you saying anything about it? And people found the answers provided unsatisfying. And it really does feel like a real problem with gatekeepers and a real problem with journalism. And particularly, I'm talking about Black journalists, because to the extent there's a powder keg ready to burst, it is concentrated among marginalized groups. And so I feel like there's even more responsibility for the people who are in a position to communicate to those groups and be honest with those groups about what's going on to do so.
I mean, I agree with that. I mean, as someone who is not a Black journalist or a writer for Ebony, I have a limited ability to change my own coverage of the Biden administration and its civil rights failures. I mean, ultimately, in my mind, I don't say that in order to dispirit people. I say it just because I'm a pessimist and, I mean, I'm a realist, but that's just a nice way of saying I'm a pessimist. That's like a self.
It doesn't have to be.
Regarding well, I mean, why not be pessimistic? I mean, I do think that's something.
No, I mean, realism doesn't have to be pessimism if we change reality.
Sure, I agree. I'm constantly trying to change reality. What do you think I do all day? Seeing the ephemerality of the BLM protests last year and the polling data that you cited, I mean, that is very dispiriting, and I think it speaks to what is a lack of sort of national organization around these issues, because I mean, I've seen BLM dismissed, from the left with the point, what has it done? Mm-hmm. And because, you and I can talk about public opinion and image or like liberal discourse or whatever, and we both recognize like that's a totally ephemeral thing. That doesn't really articulate real power structures. Mm-hmm. And, the answer is, and this is like the glass half full answer is, well, there has been real change, but only at the local level, only through efficient local organizing. And that change has not been like very radical. Like no city has abolished their police department.
Well, didn't Seattle do quite a bit?
There have been some local changes, yes, but like when we're like talking full abolition, no, nothing like that. But there's like things like pilot programs, the creation of new social services, things like that. But back to my point, like this is all happening on the local level, and what I wonder is, what would it take to get federal action on this, and which is exactly what we're talking about right now. Yes. And I mean, the answer is, I would think probably another round of nationwide protests like that.
But why do you think it would be different this time than last time? What would have to happen?
I think the one big difference is that Biden is president now, and that you can't use the excuse of, well, once we get Trump out of office, then things will be different. Now it's like, okay, you hold the ball. Like you either have to do something about it, or you're also going to look bad, and this is going to be bad for your reelection prospects.
Well, that also feels like the reason why we're not going to have another round of protests. Joe Biden being in
well,
office.
I mean, that's a big part of it, is that the like exactly what you're talking about, that this radical energy gets kind of recuperated, redirected into the into the dominant political establishment, into the institution. Because when Trump was in power, Republicans held the Senate, Democrats are shut out by and large of the actual workings of the federal government, and the left is totally shut out at every level. Then that radical energy has to go somewhere in a system that's totally unresponsive. And the whole premise of the Biden administration is, okay, we're just going to make the system responsive to these political energies, these radical energies, to this suffering and this outrage. We're going to provide a channel for that, so that energy goes somewhere, and it's going to go into Washington D.C. It's going to kind of sink into the swamp there, and pretty much nothing really changes. I don't know if another round of protests. I mean, maybe that would also be a kind of ephemeral thing, but I also kind of feel like it's a matter of, all right, if we end up in this kind of stasis of there being a horrifying incident of police brutality, which there frequently is, and yet those videos, like at this point, we're just so inured to them that they don't always set off a protest.
Well, we had one during the George Floyd trial, like a block away from the courthouse.
Yeah.
And it didn't it didn't spark anything new.
Well, I think part of that was it was enervated by the verdict. Yeah. And if the verdict had gone differently, then I think that would have set off another round of big protests.
That's a huge problem.
It is.
Because Biden today has been using the fact that Chauvin was convicted as part of kind of the narrative, or I won't say Biden, but I've seen administration statements and write-ups that basically position the administration as saying what has been achieved. The answer to that question is, well, Chauvin was convicted. And when you go back and look at the speeches that Biden was making a year ago today, he did frame a lot of his response in the terms of, we're going to get justice for your family. So already kind of preemptively narrowing what needs to be done to justice in this one case, as opposed to a systemic justice.
Right. And I mean, that's just PR. That's just pure image-based stuff. That's just like, that's the kind of politician he is.
Well, that's why it's so important to me to write stuff. Like, I've been in a writing desert, but I woke up this morning so angry because part of what I feel like is just desperately needed in journalism is journalists articulating what could be done, not just reporting on what has been done or what somebody somewhere offered and then failed to do. Because, Joe Biden never floated these ideas. No progressive Bernie didn't even float these particular ideas. Sherlyn Ifill did. And but for this leaked tape, I wouldn't even know that these kind of like ultimately milquetoast suggestions are even possible. And so many times journalists write and they don't explain how something comes to pass. What is required to pass something? Is it something that can be done by executive order? Is this something that would need X number of votes? And who are the holdouts? And where should the pressure be applied? things are reported in such vague terms and only descriptively, like this is what happened. It doesn't really empower even a focused observer of what's going on, much less a casual observer.
To bring things full circle, going back to the Israel-Palestine stuff and domestic views of it, I think what's most dispiriting is that, nothing changed at all. There wasn't a revolution, but there is a reaction now. And, Israeli government is arresting, hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians for their actions during the rioting that took place there domestically. And, for a while I really think that ceasefire was called, not because of, because Biden stepped in or any kind of bullshit like that. I think it's because they, the Netanyahu government really realized, we're in a very bad place right now. Like the actual fabric of our society is falling apart. This isn't like, the last time when, we went into Gaza. This is like, okay, well, there's a domestic issue now, and there's mobs of Muslims and Jews, and like there's actual open warfare in the streets. And for a guy who's not even a real prime minister, who's a caretaker prime minister for there's going to be another round of elections. Like I want to say the fourth round of elections in 3 years there. A country that's facing this like Netherlands-style parliamentary deadlock for the past half decade. I think there was real fear there that, this time's kind of different, and if we don't put the kibosh on like the open violence right now, then this whole arrangement that we've constructed over the past 20 years is just going to completely fall apart.
Yeah, it's, them letting the air out of the tires, letting out some steam in the same way that you're talking about in our own domestic context.
But when I say the reaction, I mean, so there's a definite reaction there in Israel, which is a country that's, constantly on a war footing. Here, there is a similar reaction happening in terms of the discourse, where the people who were, 1-2 weeks ago speaking out about Israel in serious and true terms, like openly condemning, the apartheid system in Israel and the attempted ethnic cleansing or the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, they're being forced to apologize, to walk all of that stuff back. And you saw that with Mark Ruffalo. And I think, you're seeing a bit of that from the left wing of the possible, from when, Bernie Sanders goes on television and says, we actually have to, we got to tone this down.
Yeah.
And so, that's scary and dispiriting that we can't even, we're not even allowed to get to that place where we can talk about this in honest terms publicly.
It almost feels like a trap. It almost feels like let's let them all think that the war is over so they come out of hiding and then we'll know who they are and we can track them down. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So
I
don't. So we're like, and again, when we saw what happened with Emily Wilder, we have not actually changed here in the United States in terms of the attitudes of, powerful liberals. There is no difference from the circumstances today, despite the evolving definitions of wokeness or whatever you see on Instagram or Twitter, to 2014 when Mark Lamont Hill was fired.
Right. I did, in response to Ruffalo's tweet, I saw some folks tweeting like, no, goddamn it, what you mean to say is from the river to the sea. Like they were like explicitly repeating that statement. So there are obviously people who are trying to stick the landing, and, time will tell. But what I do feel like has emerged as a definite pattern from Occupy to BLM to this moment is that there's a lot of danger in kind of declaring premature victories, or
absolutely
not even necessarily that all of the people in all of those groups did that, but that the thing that resists the pablum, the thing that resists a movement being co-opted, is really specifically connecting the movement to demands and explaining to the public exactly how possible those demands are.